Right, so our speaker for this session is Alex Bell. Alex was a journalist, was previously Alex Salmond's speechwriter, then left that to become a journalist again. At one point he was a presenter on Good Morning Scotland and Review Scotland. He then went back into work for the Scottish Government, was head of policy for the Scottish Government SNP. Alex Salmond, I don't know what the exact job title was, but Alex will no doubt enlighten us on that. So he was involved in the Edinburgh Agreement, which brought us to the referendum, and indeed I think was involved in the early stages of the white paper. A few months ago we had a conversation about what the white paper might contain, and out of that conversation arose The People We Could Be, which is Alex's book, published this very day, so it hasn't been out available to anyone anywhere until today, so we kept it out of bookshops and so on, so it's been for sale in Edinburgh Book Festival, I think from about lunchtime today, and these are the first copies of it here, and Alex will tell you all about what he was aiming to do with that. Prior to this book, we published a book, Peak Water, by Alex, which was looking at the impending global water crisis. And if anybody's interested in talking to Alex about that, either during the open session or afterwards, informally, I'm sure we'd be happy to do that. So I'll give you Alex Bell.
Thank you, Gavin. You should treat this book a bit like trapped wind. In that I built up a head of steam when I was in office for 2 years as the head of policy, and then had to sort of swallow it down when I left because I was clearly not in agreement with the government. And so this is a final burp. So think of it as me being on your shoulder and you're patting my back, and eventually we'll get rid of it all out of the system. I say that because much of, well not much, but some of the core idea of what's in the book has since taken off anyway, thankfully, delightfully. Because where we started in 2011 as head of policy to Alex Salmond, realising that we would have to construct an argument for not just for independence, but for a future state, not just for a moment, but for continuing moments, not just for our generation, but for continuing generations. You then had to have very sort of deep and complex thoughts about, well, what is the function of a state? What's it there to do? Who's meant to benefit? What's the purpose? Now, it turned out that that's not really what politicians like. When you say to them, well, what's the purpose of the state? You're liable to get quite short shrift and be told, look, I've got a speech in 20 minutes, would you just get down to the site? So, which is fair enough, because they were competing narratives there, competing urgencies there. But it's one of the massively delightful, exciting things about my lifetime is how this debate for the last 3 years has escaped the boundaries of party and government and has disseminated across previous borders, boundaries and prejudices. Anyway, let's start at the beginning. The question isn't, should we be independent? The question is, what do we want to be? That's the right question to start the process that Scotland is going through. It's not just the right question for Scotland, it's the right question for anyone. What do you want to be? What kind of society do you want? And now's a brilliant time to ask it. I'm not saying that the Scottish referendum came about because 5 million people had an existential moment about the state. No, but it's happened, so let's now use it for that exercise of what do we want to be. And the reason why it's really fascinating to happen now is that you can, in very rough terms, see between 1945, the emergence of the modern state, a lot of it built by us. The sense of a welfare state, a benign state, a state where actually the main drive wasn't either war or to combat hunger, but the hope that you could rise to a better level. And you can see that that model was adopted across the developed world and indeed is attempting to be imitated by others in the world, but you can also then see that that model from 1945 to about the late 1970s had a kind of consensus around it, and that this was an approved way of building a state. that there was an understanding, that there was a contribution made by worker, made by taxpayer, made by citizen. And then you can see from the late 1970s on the unwinding of that consensus. So the emergence of a neoliberal agenda, the emergence of the idea that actually getting rich was really what the point of stuff is about, the emergence of the idea that services could just as well be delivered by the private sector. It's very broad, it's a small book, and so, you know, there's plenty of room there to tease out more of that theory. But we don't have that time or that room. But that was the starting point of my thoughts, which is right now, if you were going to build a state in 2014, what would you want it to be like? Therefore, my book doesn't give a jot about where you decide to draw your line about oil, or what you think the currency may be. These are technical matters which do not relate to the core question. The core question is, what do you want? And to then take that answer and test it against what you're being offered. And if you find what you're being offered lacks something or is wanting, then either that means your current politics aren't addressing the needs of a crowd of people, this crowd of people by accident, by the way, not defined by ethnicity, not defined by anything more than a choice that they happen to be in Scotland. Because my book is focused on the global issue of how do people in developed states get to a state where they are happy. So again, not even about nationalism. And so let's ask that question, well, what do we want? Well, let's start with the problems. What are the problems? Well, the problems are quite obvious on one level. For a start, the global financial system doesn't work. So maybe it's a good idea that when building a state again, to kind of address that. To kind of think, well, maybe actually just listening to the banks and bowing to that policy isn't the best way to build a stable society. And then you can look at other things where you can see that voter turnout has dropped. This is familiar stuff. I'm not kind of giving you anything new here. But when you begin to build up the failure of the banks, a declining interest in democracy, a demographic shift which is permanently going to change the tax base that we have, no longer a consensus as to what exactly the relationship between the citizen and the state is. What am I paying my taxes for? Why should I pay more taxes? Aren't people somehow ripping off the state? Common phrases now in politics. So common that they deny the man who should be championing a new Britain, Ed Miliband, the courage to go there because he's so caught in that consensus of can't challenge the banks, can't challenge tax, can't challenge democratic structures, or can we? Don't know. Attack Ed Balls. So again, not a nationalist agenda, a universal agenda about how we address the problems of society. And so the first section of my book tries to tackle that. And what it tries to look at is the sense that you would want, when building a society, to have a clear relationship between citizen and the state. So I know what I'm doing here. I know that I and the community around me are in a shared exercise. A joint exercise to try and make our society fairer and better. That in fact what you would state at the very outset of the new state is the purpose of this state is to deliver the best possible quality of life to as many people within its boundaries, and that that is our function. Such that us, the people, the citizens, can say, look, our function isn't to go off maybe and do things abroad, or our function isn't maybe to spend big on defence, or our function isn't maybe just to endlessly mess around with the structures of things like the NHS. Our function is to bring everyone up to a tolerable quality. Now this then gets into the very philosophy of, if you like, modern economics. Because there's a great essay by Keynes, written in 1930, where he says precisely this. He says, look, what's the function of us all making lots of money? And this was in the 1930s. He asks, surely in 4 generations' time, we'll be a lot richer. And therefore, I imagine, with all that wealth, we will be living a life of pleasure. We will be like gentlemen in the 19th century, out in our clubs, playing tennis and possibly doing some work in the afternoon. Because why on earth would we want to keep onto the grindstone and work when we were that much richer? Now the interesting thing about Keynes' essay, he was spot on about the economics. We are much richer. And listen, he was writing during global depression. He said we would be 4 times richer. We're more than 4 times richer. We're twice as rich as we were in the 1970s. Does anyone feel rich in this room? Does anyone look outside and say that's a rich society? Not rich just in the sense that clearly Virgin and other companies are rich, but rich in the sense that we have a shared purpose. Rich in the sense that we have a society which is united to help all its people. I don't. So again, there I am, I'm sitting in St Andrew's House, that's the civil service headquarters of the Scottish Government. I'm in a small room, it's a desk all by myself. There are about 2 other civil servants who are currently engaged in this work, because most of the civil servants, contrary to what the No campaign are telling you, were actually just busy getting on governing. And I was trying to think, well, so first, Alec, what we need to do is build an argument about the purpose of the state. Now that's very true. And no wonder the politicians dropped it. Because it means saying things like this: you probably can't afford pensions as they are, full stop. I'm sorry, that's just the way it goes. And pensions in the UK at the moment are in fact a pyramid scheme. The young are paying out for the old. I don't think that's fair, and you probably need some kind of solution to that. But the argument that we were getting into was never going to be that subtle. It just had to be a great big bang of, we got a pension policy, we got a pension policy, we got more money, we got more money. But nonetheless, I thought, well, if we could take from this a sense that the UK is itself risky, where could we take that argument? If the existing 19th century state is a risky model, what would you want to do differently? So that then takes us on to the things that we might want to do differently. You might, for example, want to look at a tax system, which in the UK allows for anywhere between 40 to 45 billion pounds a year to just not get collected. And that's through evasion or avoidance. And say that therefore a tax system which is primarily based on income tax and or on corporate taxes is inefficient. It's too easy to avoid. As soon as you're rich enough to be eligible for these taxes, you're rich enough to get them accounted. And broadly, that undermines the state, because the state is unable to collect the money, number one. But number two, it means that as soon as you're rich enough, you can feel you can elevate yourself and move away from the state. The rich don't need a state. That's why they're building their own versions of it. You know, Monaco is an invention for the rich, which is fine if you can wealthy enough to qualify. But since 99% is never going to be that wealthy, we depend on the state. So we have to find a way of capturing that wealth of the very wealthy. So one of the key things I would argue is you'd move your tax system from income tax when you share it with the wealth tax of some form. Mike, who's in the room, has done a lot of work on the merits of a land value tax. And the land value tax would capture wealth. I'm not saying, and never at my point in the book do I say I have the answer. I'm not doing, I love the Alex Salmond was saying, a didactic argument which says, just trust me the whole way, it will be fine, much as I love the man. I'm giving you a range of options. I'm testing out ideas which have been current in Scotland since well before 2011, but ideas which the full debate between the existing governments has deliberately excluded because they pose too much of a challenge to the existing order. So, for example, you would shift your taxes. That is actually what would probably give you your magical £500 better off bonus. Because you would shift taxes onto wealth, you'd raise the threshold of income tax, most of us would pay less tax, only those who currently avoid tax would end up paying more tax. That would be a benefit. But you could do it different ways. I'm saying, in other words, that you have one level to engage in this argument about Scotland's future is you have to engage in the universal issues of how you structure a state, how you pay for a state, what you want from that state. And what I want from my state is that sense of fairness. I don't see that as being some massive compromise on the banks, on multinational corporations, on the ability of governments to act. I don't see that at all. Instead, I see it as the logical follow-through of the economic wealth that was created at the beginning of the 20th century, which Keynes spoke of, which has resulted in a society which is fundamentally rich, but leaves far too many of its citizens fundamentally poor. And so again, one of the strands in the white paper, which I was working on, was that we wouldn't simply increase the amount of child care, we would actually restructure the state such that its resources went in to those communities that desperately needed care from prenatal stage on.
Again, there's a huge amount of literature about this. I don't rehash all the literature. But, you know, a simple Google about early years policy will begin to open up a minefield of information, which is absolutely essential. But that requires that we begin to restructure the state towards its citizens, not towards some kind of goal of just making one. So then in the third section of the book, so the first section of the book is, what's the problem? What's the crisis? The second section is, here's some solutions which we can debate. But one of the fundamental things I say in the seventh session is it's going to take time. We have to get ourselves off this kind of Westminster loop of 5-year policy, of endless churn, of endless press releases. We have to have some kind of conversation, possibly growing out of the national conversation we're currently having, which says, where do we want to be in 20, 30, 50 years' time? Because we don't have the money to cover everything, so let's start making some priorities. But let's not do that from top-down government. Let's start doing that from the kind of grassroots conversation that has begun over the last 3 years, which I sincerely hope will carry on. Anyway, so the third section of the book is the juicy one. That's where I begin to go into why certain things went wrong in government, why the white paper ended up being, I think, in my terms, slightly a compromising white paper, but also why, when you take this fundamental test, what kind of society do I want? By any measure, it is near impossible to achieve in an unreformed UK. So if you just take a simple point of equality. So look at the problem. Will Hutton wrote a report on fair pay, commissioned by David Cameron in 2010. When David Cameron came into Parliament, he said, you know what, I don't think anyone should get paid more than the Prime Minister. So he asked Will Hutton, who's the kind of economist you go to when you want this kind of thing done, and Will Hutton went off and wrote a lovely mix of Will Hutton balminess and intelligence, and came back, but had obviously been led on by civil servants for the final version, as happens with all these things when you get someone independent to write a report and eventually gets sieved through the civil service and they get to put their own stamp on it. But reading between the lines, Will Hutton's conclusion was, well, of course you can have a wage cap and some kind of fair distribution of wages and some kind of correlation between low wages and high wages, which is highly desirable, because if you've read the stuff connected to equality, the spirit level, this kind of thinking, then that's a very desirable thing to bring back into society. But Will Hutton concludes, well, of course you can't do it, because the gap between what people are paid in London and what they're paid in Newcastle is so big, you would have to have two completely separate systems. Now, quite see that, because clearly that would open the local dialogue. But then you look at Heseltine wrote a report, on how to energise local communities with greater economic measures. Why hasn't it been enacted? Because the measures that would apply to Newcastle are utterly irrelevant to the measures that would apply to the South East of England. And then you look at the fact that the Institute IPPR Think Study eventually got off its bum in London and decided, oh gosh, something's happening in the UK, perhaps we better open an office a bit further away. And so they got as far as Newcastle and opened an office there. And they came out with a simple bit of research, which seemed to appall them and stun them at the same time, which is that for every £2,700 spent on transport per head in London, £5 is spent per head in the North East of England. And so therefore, if your ambition is for a fair society and a just society, from a purely policy and rational point of view, you cannot achieve these things in a country which has both London in it and the North East of England. I just been talking to me back to the wall again. Sorry, I was much more animated. I don't know why I got said that. So let me... But this is a crucial point. It's a crucial point because the argument for no rests on the idea that there is a unity, when in fact the economic stats, the social stats, all the stats indicate there isn't a unity. Now fine, okay, then we don't have to have the kind of UK that we want at the moment. And do you know what? We don't have to have independence either. Quite explicit like that, but you have to have a degree of powers which enables us to do the things we want to do because we've got the political energy to do it, to fix our problems. Now, if that has to happen under the banner of the Union Jack, then I'm prepared to put up with all the other stuff that goes on, which I'm not particularly mad about. But if I had the tools to tackle poverty in West Central Scotland, I'd be delighted by that alone. But when it came in 2011 to a discussion with the UK government, but could we have a middle question? Could we at least begin to expand our sense of this as not just being an animated hatred of Alex Salmond and a desire to crush his movement, but could we actually have a conversation about how the UK might change? We were told, no, no,
No. And yet now, I find, I go around the country doing these kind of talks, and I find people saying, oh, of course, you know, after this we'll have a commission, and we'll all discuss how we're going to change the UK. Yeah, that's what we're going to do all along. And you think, no, you weren't. Scotland has dragged the debate along and forward brilliantly to the credit of everyone. But still, you will not get that social justice if you operate in this existing system. Your only choice is to fundamentally change the system. Either you can do that within the UK, in which case you can take your chances on that no vote, or you have to recognise that the yes vote is a moment not for Scotland to become isolated or leave something, but for Scotland to set a model for the rest of the world for something. To start again. To not assume that the banks and the corporations are the only thing that we can rely on, but to assume that the will of the people is good enough. And that the will of the people have enough money within their country to do the things that will change their country. And that if the will of the people is stuck to, then we stand as good a chance as anyone, you know. And we're never going to be the world's best, and we're never going to be the world's worst. But we're good enough to do it well enough to set a model for everyone. So when Tony Abbott tells me, what would Scottish independence contribute to the world, I want to say, Tony, well, how about a nation which is tolerant of all sexes and genders and supports same-sex marriage? How about a nation which is tolerant of all races and ethnicities and doesn't attempt to murder some with a highly corrupt judicial system? How about a nation which doesn't just abandon all green targets just because it's found another coal mine and realises that China wants to buy it at top dollar? How about a nation which stops acting in the old way, the 19th century way, and how about a nation which chooses to be different? Which, that's why the book isn't called Vote Yes, Nationalism's Groovy, I've got time on fans. The book's called The People We Could Be. You arrive at being the people we could be by having the kind of discussion which in 2011 didn't seem at all possible, which has now ignited and started, but which needs to continue. You arrive by having a sense of, well, okay, we're going to have to make compromises, we're not going to get everything on the table, but what are the priorities, what are the main things that we want to do? We arrive by the fact that you will have to shift taxation, it's just a fundamental, onto wealth if you want to have a stable base for paying for pensions in the long term, if nothing else, but the NHS and all this other stuff that you kind of care about, that comes into that too. We arrive on the sense that from 1945 and the late 1970s, there was a consensus which allowed a social transformation in the United Kingdom. A social transformation so successful it was adopted and copied by every other developed state in one form or another. And that social transformation began to stop, grind, and go into reverse over the last 30 years. I give this to you not because I want to live from 1945 to 1970, so I'm happy where I am now. I give this to you because it's quite possible within human ability to change things if there's a consensus, enough time, and a